So if this active God existed for all eternity before the present day, as classical theists claim to believe, he would have experienced an infinite number of these DT in the real Mormon universe or in the metaphysical Greek universe. The whole point is, Beckwith says this is impossible, but it's not. It's not impossible at all. Beckwith's position says it is impossible to traverse an infinite number of DT and thereby arrive at the present day. This position clearly denies the existence of an infinite God, whether in the real universe or the metaphysical universe. That conclusion is unbiblical, and therefore that conclusion is false. Beckwith is simply wrong. The only alternative now is that premise number 2 is false. It actually is possible to traverse an infinite number. And that number doesn't matter whether it's of points, or of days, or of miles, or of events. And it is possible to do so and still exist at this present day. We do it every day. That's the lesson of infinity. This is both true mathematically and philosophically, and if God has done it, then there can be no theological objection to its accomplishment by men who have already lived forever. Now, interestingly enough, the existence of God throughout all eternity is both a doctrine of classical theism and of Mormonism, of course. If there is no mathematical, and there is no philosophical, and there is no logical barrier to that claim, it follows, obviously, that there can be no valid philosophical barrier to the Mormon concept of man's being eternal also. Indeed, it is possible for an infinite universe, containing an infinite quantity of elements and intelligences, to exist at the present moment, to have existed forever in an infinite past, and to exist forevermore on into the future. There can be no philosophical objection to that. If classical theists cannot establish a philosophical objection to an infinite God, then they can't establish a philosophical valid problem with the Mormon concept of an infinite universe. Because if one is infinite, then the other can be logically with no problems to either one. And in the Mormon view, not only is the universe infinite, not only is God infinite, but the very intelligence of man is also infinite. Very different from Greek classical theism, for sure. Well, then he gets to the problem of eternal progression. And here is Beckwith's actually one of his main arguments, that one of his main beefs that he has against Mormonism. He says eternal progression is not presented, Hopkins says that he doesn't present his objection against eternal progression in a syllogism. Here is Beckwith's claim. If the past series of events in time is infinite, we men should have already reached our final state by now. Yet we have not reached our final state by now. Therefore, the Mormon worldview is seriously flawed. The Mormon may respond by arguing that we have not yet reached our final state because there has not been enough time for it to have transpired. But this is certainly no solution, since the Mormon's own worldview affirms that an infinite length of time has already transpired. One cannot ask for more than an infinite amount of time in order to complete a task. We must conclude then that since none of us has reached our final state, whether it be deity or some posthumous reward or punishment, the past series of events in time cannot be infinite in the sense that the Mormon Church teaches. For even if we assume that the past is infinite, we have not yet reached our inevitable fate that the Mormon worldview is still false. Thus, Dr. Beckwith argues that if the intelligences of all men started the course of their eternal progression an infinite number of years ago, then we should have already achieved godhood by now, because we've had an infinite amount of time to do it. So, since we aren't into our final reward, and all of us are not gods and goddesses yet, an infinite past is false. And so is our ideas in the LDS theology. That's Beckwith's argument. Fascinating, isn't it? Fun stuff. The answer is as simple as it is obvious. What Beckwith has forgotten about is that an infinite period of time can contain up to an infinite number of infinite periods. He has not bothered to consider the more than one infinite period may be involved in man's eternal progression, especially if he is to be infinite like God. This argument also shows Dr. Beckwith is unfamiliar with LDS theology regarding the course of eternal progression. Like I've said, if you're going to discuss LDS theology, make sure you understand it so that you're comparing apples to apples. To answer his objection, let's examine more extensively the doctrine of eternal progression in each of its major segments. Segment number 1 of eternal progression is the intelligence. Now, if you're going to argue against Mormonism, this is what you have to understand about Mormonism, especially if you bring up this concept of infinity. You can bring your own disagreements to the fore, but you're not arguing against your disagreements. You're arguing against Mormonism. So here's the system of Mormonism. The first segment of eternal progression is when we were intelligences, and there was a spirit birth of those eternal intelligences. The fact that man existed in some form before they came spirit children of God is information that comes from modern revelation. That's the beauty of the restoration. More light and more knowledge. The exact process we don't know about, but we do know that we were intelligences before we had our spirits. There is a personal use of the term intelligence in Abraham 3:22, because it speaks of spirits as the intelligences that were organized before the world was. So we existed before this earth. Somehow we were organized into spirit beings. That is the Mormon theology. Ontologically, Abraham's words could be interpreted as saying that the spirit body itself is composed of the personal intelligence of the being, created or organized, based on the usage of intelligence and spirit element in the scriptures. Another possibility is the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis 7:39, which is extremely interesting here. He says, "There the Lord says to Enoch, Behold these thy brethren, they are the workmanship of mine own hands, and I gave them their intelligence in the day I created them." Now this implies that the workmanship of God, the spirit body, was infused with each personal intelligence. That's another way to interpret that. There is a similar infusion of spirit body with the personal intelligence. This is the first stage of our eternal progression. In the case of mortal men, this is where our spirit infuses our physical body. This is the next stage of progression. Now that's not permanent until the resurrection occurs. Okay? So this isn't the situation in the original creation. Originally, Adam and Eve were made immortal, and then they fell. This fall, this mortality, is not going to be the final state of mankind. It's just a transitory period, according to LDS theology. And of course, we find ourselves subject to death, which is the separation of the body and the spirit.